For centuries, Britain has been gripped by its great aristocratic dynasties, all at the center of power, for no reason other than they were born to it. But none have scandalized, polarized, or mesmerized the public quite like the Mitfords. A minor aristocratic family with a major grip on the public imagination, they burst onto the world stage in the 1930s and never truly left it. They were beautiful, brilliant, and utterly outrageous. One became a duchess, one a die-hard communist, another a fascist so enthralled by Hitler she followed him to Nazi Germany and attempted suicide when it became clear he was hell-bent on war. One would write best-selling novels about love and English snobbery, while another preferred the quiet peace of life on her farm. Their political extremism, high society affairs, and internecine rivalries played out against the backdrop of global war and domestic upheaval. But behind the headlines and the scandal lay something deeper. They were daughters, sisters, lovers, writers, each wrestling with the constraints of class, gender, and history. They were 6 sisters the world couldn't ignore. 1 brother lost too soon. 2 parents divided by ideology and heartbreak, unable to hold their dazzling, combustible children together. Over 8 decades after the height of their fame and notoriety, the Mitford sisters continue to captivate, provoke, and beguile. Their scandals and stories still echo through the corridors of history, as irresistible and unsettling as ever. Who were these sisters? What forces drove them to such dazzling heights and dangerous extremes? What ignited such fire and fervor in the hearts of 6 women born into a world of comfort, privilege, and tradition? Join us as we explore their story, unfiltered, outrageous, and utterly unforgettable. This is the full story of the Mitford family, and if you enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most extraordinary figures. Let's get started. At the tender age of 14, Sydney Bowles found herself utterly smitten with the dashing 17-year-old David Freeman Mitford during a fateful visit to his family's grand estate, Batsford. The encounter, carefully arranged by her father, the eccentric MP and newspaper magnate Thomas Bowles, was ostensibly a social call to his dear friend, Lord Redesdale, David's father. But for young Sydney, it was a moment that would forever change the course of her life. She later confessed it was the very instant she lost her heart to the charming young man. The Mitfords were far from your average family, in terms of both their bloodline and the legacy they left behind. Tracing their roots in Northumberland all the way back to the time of the Norman conquest, these descendants of the landed gentry could even count the renowned historian William Mitford among their ancestors. Leading the 20th century branch of the family was David Freeman Mitford, the 2nd Baron Redesdale. Later given the nickname Favre by his children, he was a gruff, stubborn, and quirky character who his daughters remembered as both comical and tyrannical. David's parents were quite the pair themselves. His father, the distinguished Algernon Bertram Freeman Mitford, 1st Baron Redesdale, and his mother, the elegant Lady Clementine Gertrude Helen Ogilvy, daughter of the 10th Earl of Airlie, connected the Mitfords to a vast network of British aristocracy. In fact, Lady Clementine's sister, Lady Blanche Hosier, went on to become the mother of Clementine Hosier, the very same Clementine who would one day marry Winston Churchill himself. Now, here is where the family history takes a scandalous turn. Rumor has it that the 1st Baron Redesdale might have actually been Clementine Churchill's father, the product of an alleged affair with his sister-in-law, Lady Blanche. While this gossip has never been proven beyond a doubt, and other potential fathers like William George Middleton have been suggested, the speculation has stuck to both families like a stubborn stain on a white tablecloth. It's the kind of tidbit that keeps tongues wagging for generations. While the Mitford children later maintained a friendly rapport with the Churchills, Sydney strictly forbade any close association with the Romilly boys, Giles and Esmond, due to the perceived instability of their mother, Nellie Hosier. From a young age, Sydney had taken on the role of the woman of the house. Tragically losing her mother at the tender age of 7, she bravely stepped up to manage the family's London residence on Lowndes Square. Prior to this, she had spent 6 extraordinary years at sea following her mother's passing, embarking on a grand voyage through the exotic lands of the Middle East aboard the majestic 150-ton schooner, the Nereid, with her father at the helm as captain. He would later publish the ship's log, proudly recounting how his children weathered the storms with greater resilience than their seasick governess. During election seasons, they campaigned from the deck of a second yacht, the Hoyden, and their summers were spent basking in the sun-drenched splendor of France. These formative travels undoubtedly shaped Sydney into the fiercely independent and hard-headed woman she would become. David Freeman Mitford had a tough go of it growing up, always living in the shadow of his older brother Clement. His violent temper and undiagnosed dyslexia didn't do him any favors either, leaving him feeling isolated and struggling in school. It was for these reasons that he was shipped off to Radley College. The only bright spot during this time was his French tutor, a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War. The tutor's immersive lessons and captivating war stories helped to calm him and left a lasting mark on young David. After catastrophically failing the Sandhurst exam, David found himself on a boat to Ceylon to work as a tea planter, the typical path for a second son who wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. But then, in 1898, the Second Boer War broke out, and David's luck started to change. He signed up with the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, got wounded twice, and earned some well-deserved respect for his service. He even wrote home asking for an officer's commission. Things were looking up for David until a devastating chest wound in 1901 put an abrupt end to his military career. David lost a lung and came back to England disabled. Through all those years apart, David and Sydney never lost their connection. They kept in touch through letters and probably bumped into each other at family gatherings. When David was laid up in the hospital, he even had someone write a letter to Sydney for him, just in case he didn't make it. By the time David made it back to England, Sydney was mourning another lost love. But those old feelings came rushing back, and on February 6th, 1904, a decade after they first met, David and Sydney were married. Their first child, Nancy, was born on November 28, 1904, and though Sydney had hoped for a boy, David was utterly delighted. Pamela followed on November 25, 1907, and on January 2, 1909, they finally welcomed a son, Tom. When Diana arrived on June 17, 1910, she formed an instant and deep bond with Tom, dubbing themselves the Almost Twins. Sydney reportedly wept upon learning she'd had yet another girl, but Diana's breathtaking beauty, with her porcelain skin, golden locks, and striking blue eyes, quickly consoled her. These features, save for Nancy's darker coloring and distinctive green triangular eyes, would become the iconic Mitford trademarks. Nancy's beloved first nanny, Lily Kersey, was dismissed after Pamela's birth to maintain emotional balance. Nora Evans took her place, but was eventually succeeded by a far more ominous figure, the unkind nanny. This nanny wielded a silent cruelty, once banging Nancy's head against a bedpost and telling Diana she was too beautiful to live long. When Sydney discovered the abuse, she collapsed in bed, her typical response to shock, while David reacted with a fury, confronting the nanny in what Nancy later described as a mastodon clash. Despite this, Nancy retained a twisted affection for her tormentor. The unkind nanny was replaced by Laura Dix, affectionately known as Nanny Blore, a pale, red-haired woman who would become a fixture in their home for nearly 30 years. In true Edwardian fashion, David and Sydney saw their children briefly each day. Dressed by staff each morning, the children were brought downstairs for formal parental greetings before being handed back to the care of the nanny and governess. In 1911, 3-year-old Pamela contracted polio. Sydney, echoing her father's distrust of medicine, initially resisted doctors in favor of natural remedies. But as Pamela's condition worsened, she called in 6 physicians, none of whom could help. Finally, she turned to Dr. Carl Kellgren, a renowned Swedish osteopath known for his physiotherapy and massage techniques. Under his care, Pamela made a near-complete recovery, with only a slight weakness remaining in one leg. As finances tightened, David chased new fortune in gold. Inspired by the Klondike Rush and his time in South Africa, he staked claims near a mining town in Ontario, ominously named Swastika. Though the venture ultimately failed, the experience brought the couple closer together. Living in a rustic cabin called the Shack, they went without servants, with Sydney baking bread and hauling water by hand, while David donned corduroy knickers and a leather vest, later declaring it the happiest time of his life. It was during their time in Canada that Sydney became pregnant with their 5th child. Upon returning to London, they moved to a larger home at 49 Victoria Road in Kensington. On August 8, 1914, just 4 days after Britain entered World War I, Sydney gave birth to a daughter. They named her Unity after actress Unity Moore, and her dramatic middle name, Valkyrie, was suggested by Lord Redesdale in tribute to the fierce Norse warrior maidens. As Sydney recovered, the children watched the war unfold from their grandfather's balcony, observing troops marching down Kensington High Street. Nancy, ever the precocious one, knitted a purple scarf for a soldier, calling herself a tricoteuse, evoking the grim knitters of the French Revolution. Tragedy struck when David's brother Clement was killed in action soon after receiving the Distinguished Service Order. He left behind a pregnant widow, Helen, and a daughter, Rosemary. When Helen gave birth to another daughter, Clementine, it was legally established that David would inherit the Redesdale title. Emotionally, however, he remained distant, focusing instead on his war service. The Mitford children were homeschooled by a governess, Miss Meerams, in line with Edwardian norms. David and Sydney believed girls only needed the basics: literacy, French, polite conversation, and needlework. Only Tom, as the heir, would attend boarding school. Sydney had ambitious hopes, wanting them to read the Times editorials by age 6, but her pregnancies and duties often pulled her away. On September 11, 1917, Sydney, nicknamed Muv by her children, gave birth to Jessica, named after Sydney's late mother and later affectionately nicknamed Decca. Under Miss Meerams's tutelage, the children split into 2 academic groups. Nancy, an advanced reader, studied alone, while Pamela, Tom, Diana, and cousins Sibel and Mark formed the second group. Pamela, later recognized as dyslexic, struggled with reading and was often teased. Despite this, their education proved effective, with Tom's top form placement at Lockers Park outshining elite prep students. They also had access to Bertie Mitford's vast library of history and literature. The war's end brought national relief, but personal loss, as Batsford, the ancestral estate, was sold. In 1919, the family moved to Astall Manor in Oxfordshire, initially intended as a temporary stop, but soon beloved. Though haunted by ghost stories, dripping noises, unexplained footsteps, and the eerie nursery view over the churchyard, it became the sisters' mythical childhood home. In 1920, 40-year-old Sydney gave birth to her 7th child, Deborah. David, hoping for another son, reacted with visible disappointment. Parlour-maid Mabel recalled, "He looked like thunder." For weeks, baby Deborah was ignored. 16-year-old Nancy, already known for her sharp wit, was made the baby's godmother. Sydney, fearing she might not live to raise her youngest, made the choice with serious intent. Nancy later teased Deborah about her icy reception for years, saying, "Everyone cried when you were born." By 1920, the Mitford children formed a charming stair-step. Nancy was 16, Pamela 13, Tom 11, Diana 10, Unity 6, Decca 3, and newborn baby Deborah. Despite later complaints of rural monotony, they remembered Astol fondly. The younger siblings invented secret languages and clubs, with Unity and Jessica affectionately calling each other Bood, creating a vulgar coded language called Boodleditch. Later, Decca and Deborah co-founded the Society of Hans, originally hens, inspired by chickens, Robert Burns' poetry, and lays of ancient Rome. Their club boasted chants, rituals, and frog-hopping games. The Hans were born as a protest. Nancy, furious with Tom, declared herself head of the League against Tom. Deborah hit back with a badge reading, League against Nancy, head Tom. The group also spoke Hannish, a cousin dialect of Boodleditch. Sibling teasing was brutal but affectionate, with Decca later saying their anti-Tom antics were proof of love. Her real rivalries were with Unity and Deborah, whom she called ill-assorted animals tied to a common tethering post. She loathed the schoolroom but adored the library, which she considered a heavenly escape. Nancy, desperate to attend school, was repeatedly denied. David told her flatly, only boys went. Finally, in 1921, Sydney relented and enrolled 16-year-old Nancy at Hathrop Castle, a private girls' school under the Parents' National Education Union (PNEU), run by Lady Basily. Later Mrs. Cadogan. It admitted only daughters of suitable families. Nancy thrived. She adored French lessons with Mademoiselle Pierra, piano practice, and weekly dance classes designed for debutante prep. These classes became more fun when Pamela and Diana visited, chauffeured by Nanny in the Morris Cowley's open-air dicky seat. Pam, still recovering from polio, joined in gamely, while Diana enjoyed the dancing but dreaded school. Back home, Nancy joined the Girl Guides and proposed a Swinbrook troupe, making herself captain, with Pam and Diana as lieutenants. Nancy turned the whole affair into comedic material, her razor wit picking at every sibling insecurity. Decca called her a cosmic teaser, and the nickname she gave each sibling stuck with them. Knit for Unity, Sick for Decca, and Bore for Deborah. Inspired by Nancy's success at Hathrop, Sydney hired a PNEU-trained governess, Miss Hussey, for the younger girls. The PNEU emphasized sensory learning, independent thought, and regular exams. While the system led to phonetic spelling errors, it encouraged confidence and creativity, a foundation that would lead Nancy, Diana, Decca, and Deborah to become best-selling authors. David played no role in his daughter's education. Publicly, he maintained a busy civic life, county council, local bench, and chairing the House of Lords Drains Committee. Privately, he followed a rigid Edwardian routine, rising early in a paisley robe, sipping tea from a vacuum flask that startled the maids, eating breakfast precisely at 8:30, and spending his days striding fields with a thumbstick, hunting or fishing. Nancy later confessed she respected Sydney but never loved her, their home lacking hugs, warmth, or affection. As adults, Jessica and Diana echoed this emotional distance, though Deborah, the youngest and favored after the others left, remembered no chill. Jessica later admitted it was the children who had changed, not Sydney. Nancy's 17th birthday in November 1921 marked a quiet turning point. As the first to leave home, her departure foreshadowed the family's slow unraveling. She joined a Queen's Gate school tour of France and Italy, not as a student, but as a companion to her friend Marjorie Murray. It was her first taste of freedom, her letters overflowing with delight. Paris was heavenly, Florence romantic, Venice flea-ridden but thrilling. She paid street musicians to follow them, soaked in architecture, and reveled in her independence. Still, she felt painfully self-conscious. Her homemade clothes paled beside her classmates' tailoring. David forbade makeup, yet she adored dormitory life, loving the pillow fights, pranks, and whispered gossip. She even flirted with a 45-year-old fellow Ruskin fan, whom she teasingly called old. Returning to Astall Manor felt stifling, Nancy's widened worldview clashing with the rural quiet. Pamela stayed content, while Diana longed for more. Nancy had long dreamed of her debutante ball, but the night was a letdown. Her dance partners were mostly cousins or family friends. She arrived elegant in a silver-beaded flapper dress, curls pinned up, longing for the bob haircut her parents forbade. Nancy soon found her footing among the bright young things. Post-war London's glittering youth, a world of jazz parties, cloche hats, bobbed hair, cigarette holders, horses' necks, and irreverent rebellion. Her letters buzzed with motion, hunt balls, weekends away, loaned horses. Though not quite upper crust, she lingered at the fringes, her 125-pound allowance, equal to a governess's, barely covering tips, travel, gifts, and clothes. Her wardrobe remained homemade, and she knew it. Through her cousin Kathleen Thynne, Nancy met Lord Henry Weymouth and his Oxford circle, bohemian, witty, mostly gay aesthetes dubbed the Brideshead generation, Nina Seafield, Mark Ogilvy Grant, Robert Byron, Harold Acton, Brian Howard. Nancy became their darling, her pyrotechnical wit lighting up every room. Though some credited Tom, still a boy at Eton, for her entree, she carved her place entirely alone. Over 3 seasons, she drifted from debutante life toward the artistic elite who would define her future. Yet even in the 1920s, a young woman's freedom had limits. Girls couldn't walk unchaperoned, enter certain neighborhoods, or shop at Harrods alone. Only in the countryside could they move freely, and even then, only on foot or horseback in pairs. At home, David's xenophobia loomed large. Decca recalled his disdain for Huns, frogs, Americans, blacks, even relatives. Nancy risked his wrath by inviting friends. He called unwanted visitors puppies or sewers, a misremembered Tamil insult from his time in Ceylon. Nancy's friends embraced it, dubbing themselves the Swinbrook Sewers. David loathed Nancy's circle. He threw out James Lee's Milne for criticizing nationalism and ejected another guest simply for carrying a pocket comb. Yet Lee's Milne remained fond of the family, smitten with Diana, admiring Sidney's elegance, and dubbing Nancy's wit a fishhook hidden in feathers. Nancy rebelled quietly but relentlessly. Claiming to visit Tom at Eton, she slipped away to Oxford to see Brian Howard and his crowd. When a neighbor spotted her walking alone, David exploded, accusing her of ruining her reputation and declaring that if she were married, it would be grounds for divorce. He banned her from future balls and confined her to the house. But she only escalated. She invited forbidden guests, stirred arguments, and in 1924, bobbed her hair without permission. Sidney's icy verdict, "No one will look at you twice now." Nancy also took to wearing trousers at home. David retaliated by cracking his stock whip at dawn, terrifying guests and heightening tensions. Meanwhile, Tom's Oxford friends, the Fat Fairs, were welcomed, perhaps because David had grown weary of Nancy's rebellion. Pamela returned from France in 1923, had a quiet 1924 debut, and happily settled into country life. Gentle, domestic, and fond of animals, she was nicknamed Woman or Woo for her maturity. Diana, affectionate and poised, had tutored Jessica and caught Randolph Churchill's eye as early as 1921. She prepared for her debut as the family moved from Astall to 26 Rutland Gate in London, purchased with Sidney's inheritance, while David supervised construction on Swinbrook House, his dream country estate. That autumn, Sidney took the girls to Paris. Diana enrolled at the Élite Cours Fénelon and was painted several times by Paul César Helleu, who nicknamed her La Grace. She excelled academically while the younger girls had lessons and played in the Bois de Boulogne. Nancy and Pam, with help from Mitty O'Neill, mingled with the embassy set. Diana loved her Paris independence, living frugally and using her music lessons as cover to sneak off to tea dances. Helliu mentored her until illness ended their visits. After his death, she returned to England with one of his portraits, later published in L'Illustration. Before returning to Paris, Diana made a dire mistake. She left her diary open in the drawing room and Sidney read it. Inside were innocent admissions, like sneaking to the cinema with a boy, but enough to spark scandal. Diana feared worse entries about Helliu. David and Sidney froze her out. Her sisters mocked her, wondering how she could be so stupid. Harsh punishments followed. Diana was banned from the London season and exiled to a remote Devon cottage, Buck's Mill, owned by Lady Maud White. With only Nanny, Miss Bedell, and her youngest sisters for company, it was a devastating fall. That summer, the Mitfords moved into the newly built Swinbrook house. David and little Deborah were thrilled, but the others found it cold and sterile. Nancy dubbed it Swinebrook, mocking its polished impersonality. After her exile, Diana resumed visits to the Churchills at Chartwell, meeting luminaries like painter Walter Sickert and physicist Frederick Lindemann, who once calculated that Churchill's champagne intake could fill a railway carriage. Lindemann, austere but fond of Diana, urged her to learn German, noting Tom was already studying in Vienna. When Diana asked David for permission, bringing up the fact that Tom was allowed to learn, he refused and snapped at her. Why wouldn't Tom be allowed to learn German? Tom's a boy. Diana, meanwhile, was not afforded the same freedom. She quipped she might as well have asked to learn the can-can, given the reaction it provoked. Tom, the family golden boy, was seen as musical, intellectual, and charming. Though outsiders found him arrogant, his sisters adored him. At Eton, he had several same-sex relationships, discussed openly with his siblings, once amusing them when Sidney unknowingly suggested he room with one of his lovers. Rather than study law or music, Tom immersed himself in German culture. He visited Schloss Bernstein in Hungary, where he was surrounded by seances and mysticism, and fell in love with German literature and art. He eventually moved to Berlin to study law. In autumn 1927, Diana debuted at a Churchill-hosted ball at Oxford's Radcliffe Infirmary. Lindemann teased her about future suitors. When formally presented at court in spring 1928, she caused a stir. James Lees Milne called her the most flawlessly beautiful woman he had ever seen. Not everyone agreed. Michael Byrne found her beauty cold, and Diana herself thought Cousin Clementine was prettier. In 1928, 18-year-old Diana fell in love with Brian Guinness, a 22-year-old heir to a brewing fortune. Though wealthy, it was his gentle artistic spirit that captivated her. They quickly became engaged, but Sidney, concerned about their youth, demanded a 2-year wait, later shortened to 1. Diana responded with silent protest, sulking around the house, skipping meals, and avoiding family life. Around the same time, Pam became engaged to Oliver Watney, another brewing heir with tuberculosis. David approved. Watney proposed with a ring, modeled after King Alfred's jewel, which Nancy mocked as a chicken's mess, a phrase she'd later reuse in The Pursuit of Love. When Oliver's father died, his mother pressured him to end the engagement. Pam, ambivalent, accepted with grace, though David and Sidney were furious. Tom returned the gifts. Pam joked the ring ended up with Nanny, who gave it to Hitler. Nancy shocked the family by falling for Hamish St. Clair Erskine, flamboyant, witty, 4 years her junior, and gay. Both fathers disapproved. Even Tom, once romantically involved with Hamish at Eton, thought the match doomed. Eventually, Diana was allowed to announce her engagement. At the time, the family was scattered. Swinbrook and Rutland Gate were rented out. Nancy was in Scotland, Pam in Swastika, Ontario, Tom in Vienna, and the youngest girls by the seaside. Diana visited Brian's estate in Sussex with Nanny. He proudly told his eccentric mother, Lady Evelyn, that Diana could cook, though Diana later admitted she could only fry eggs. As the January 30th, 1929 wedding neared, excitement filled the house. Jessica and Deborah were delighted with their gold and cream bridesmaid dresses, especially Deborah, used to hand-me-downs. Diana, radiant in her gown, struggled to hide her laughter at some gaudy wedding gifts, earning a sharp rebuke from David. The event was hailed as the wedding of the year, but not all the sisters attended. Jessica and Deborah had to be quarantined, either for scarlet fever or whooping cough. Most likely, it stemmed from Sydney's refusal to vaccinate. Diana later admitted the day felt spoiled without them. On honeymoon in Sicily, Diana felt free, at last beyond the reach of parents and governesses. She fell in love with adult conversation, ancient ruins, art, almond blossoms, and the Mediterranean. She wrote she could have stayed forever. Back in London, she and Brian settled at 10 Buckingham Street, a Latvians-designed home furnished by his parents. It wasn't to her taste, but she was content. She briefly tracked expenses in a ledger from Sydney, until Brian's mother, Lady Evelyn, was horrified, and she stopped. The family's discreet taste misled Diana into underestimating their wealth. By the age of 21, she was mistress of 4 homes: Buckingham Street, Biddesden in Hampshire, Poole Place, a seaside gift from Lady Evelyn, and Knockmaroon in Dublin. Robert Byron estimated Brian's income at £20,000 a year, accurate for a Guinness heir. At home, Jessica, now 11, grew restless. She missed Diana, but more deeply she felt stifled, haunted by a suffocating sense of permanence. Though she later painted her childhood in bleak hues, others, Brian included, remembered her as imaginative, mischievous, and bright. She dreamed of escape and opened a running away account at Drummond's Bank with 10 shillings. The amused manager gave her a passbook. More than escape, she craved education. Unlike her sisters, she saw it as essential. Her parents' refusal to let her attend school became a lifelong wound. Determined, she biked to Burford Grammar School and asked the headmaster to admit her. He agreed if she passed the exam and gave her a reading list. Elated, she asked Sydney for the books. Sydney refused without explanation. The rejection shattered Jessica's fragile trust in governesses. She later admitted she could have studied harder, but the chance was gone. After Diana's marriage, Jessica turned to Tom. Her rebellion became intellectual. He introduced her to Milton, Boswell, and Balzac, offering the challenge and stimulation the household denied her. Unity, by contrast, became wild. She climbed roofs, smashed greenhouses, and ran riot. With no outlet, she was given her own art-filled sitting room, dubbed the Drawing from the Drawing Room, or DFD, later shared with Jessica. Diana and Brian visited Tom in Berlin, where he was studying law. He described student riots and casually mentioned Nazis. Though not a fascist, Tom said he'd support them over communists, his anti-communism already deeply rooted. In 1928, Nancy enrolled at the Slade School of Art, only to be dismissed by Professor Henry Tonks, who told her to focus on domestic skills. Nancy joked her flat was full of underwear. Jessica, denied any opportunity, deeply resented her sister's flippant attitude toward education. Nancy began writing for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, earning £22 per article, often spent on lavish gifts for the emotionally distant Hamish St. Clair Erskine. In London, she hosted dazzling parties and watched Evelyn Waugh's marriage to Evelyn Gardner collapse, largely due to his coldness and sexuality. The 1928 to 1929 seasons were pure spectacle with clown balls and Roman orgies. Diana and Brian, meanwhile, preferred elegance, hosting figures like Noel Coward, Lytton Strachey, and Waugh, who began vile bodies after attending their 1860s-themed party. Nancy briefly lived with Evelyn Gardner post-divorce, then unhappily returned to Swinbrook, now chaotic, loud, and crawling with animals. Watching Diana flourish while she remained unmarried and creatively stalled only deepened her gloom. That summer in Paris, Diana and Brian hosted Waugh during his heartbreak. Nancy joined and bonded intensely with him. He helped polish her debut novel Highland Fling, borrowing Jessica's phrase, perfectly sheepish. In March 1930, Diana gave birth to her son Jonathan. Waugh and Randolph Churchill were named godfathers. A second son, Desmond, would follow in September 1931. Despite the Great Depression, Diana returned swiftly to high society, attending treasure hunts and the infamous Bruno hat hoax, with Tom posing as the fictional artist. During her pregnancy, Waugh developed feelings for Diana. After her social return, his jealousy surged. He stormed out of Poole Place and later sent a frosty apology. They wouldn't speak again until 1966, shortly before his death, when he admitted his love had gone unreturned. Waugh's Vile Bodies, released in January 1930, was dedicated to Diana and Brian. Nancy's Highland Fling neared completion. To supplement her income, she took a £250-a-year post at the Lady, writing clever columns, including satirical advice on portrait posing. That spring, Unity was expelled from Queen's Gate School. Sydney responded by sending Jessica and Deborah to a day school in High Wycombe. Deborah lasted 3 days. Jessica thrived, until Sydney forbade her from inviting a friend to tea, citing the girl's unknown mother. It exposed class prejudice and Jessica's outsider status. She was withdrawn and returned to homeschooling. At 13, Jessica became politicized. News of poverty and police brutality radicalized her. She devoured Cry Havoc by Beverly Nichols and embraced socialism. She grew frustrated with Nancy's supposedly radical friends, whom she felt lacked true commitment to social justice. Despite past rivalry, Jessica and Unity bonded as teens. They confided in their private sanctuary, the heated linen closet dubbed the Hans cupboard. Unity dreamed of meeting Adolf Hitler, Jessica dreamed of becoming a communist, and Deborah dreamed of marrying a duke. Jessica admired Unity's daring, though they stood on opposite extremes, while Deborah remained serene, happiest among animals. In 1930, Unity was invited to leave St. Margaret's Bushy, officially for altering poetry on Speech Day, though chronic misbehavior was the real cause. Years later, the school expunged her records, which deeply wounded her. Though Jessica claimed she radicalized Unity, Unity was already immersed in fascist literature. At 15, she proudly owned a signed copy of Juiceus. At home, Unity and Jessica split their shared sitting room, the DFD, along ideological lines. Unity's half-displayed swastikas and portraits of Hitler, while Jessica's half-displayed portraits of Vladimir Lenin and communist symbols. They carved slogans into windows and plastered walls with propaganda. In the spring of 1932, Unity was presented at court with cousin Robin Farrer. Both, unusually tall, were placed at the back of the line. Unity drew scandal with her capes, jewelry, and stunts, smuggling her pet rat Ratular, or sometimes her snake, Enid, into events, including a Buckingham Palace garden party. She stole palace stationery to write sarcastic thank you notes. Though strikingly Grecian, Unity was socially awkward. Self-conscious about her height, she avoided smiling in photos to prevent wrinkles. Her flamboyance was both insecurity and rebellion. In 1930, Brian qualified as a barrister, but court clerks withheld cases, assuming he didn't need income. Disillusioned, he turned to art and writing. In 1931, Diana and Brian moved to 96 Cheney Walk and bought Biddesden, a Hampshire estate haunted by a massive portrait of General Webb. Diana, afraid of ghosts, refused to enter until Lytton Strachey soothed her with a teasing letter. They transformed Biddesden into a bohemian salon. Guests included John Betjeman, Augustus John, Dora Carrington, Strachey, Professor Lindemann, the Sitwells, the Huxleys, the Actons, and Randolph Churchill. Nearby, Pamela ran a 350-acre dairy farm. Though inexperienced, she earned the locals' respect as Miss Pam. Poet John Betjeman became infatuated with her. Enchanted by her calm and countryside charm, he found her kite-flying absurd but endearing. He proposed twice. She rejected him once outright. The second time, she delayed. Her quiet preference for Austrian Count Janos von Almacy ultimately ended Bechamon's hopes. For her 22nd birthday in June 1932, Diana threw a glamorous party at Cheyne Walk in gray chiffon and diamonds. Among the guests were Winston Churchill, Augustus John, and Oswald Mosley, whom she had met that spring. Initially indifferent, Diana was unexpectedly drawn to his intellect. At the party, Mosley declared his love. By morning, he was calling her darling. Though still married and devoted to Brian, she was stirred by Mosley's charisma and ambition. The suicide of Dora Carrington, using a gun lent by Brian, shook Diana deeply, forcing her to question whether her marriage was a true partnership or an escape. Mosley's sudden emotional and political pull complicated everything. Both Diana and Jessica were moved by Depression-era suffering. Jessica turned to communism. Diana, drawn to order and control, found hope in Mosley's authoritarian promise. At the time, Mosley was a rising star. Elected to Parliament in 1918 as a conservative, he joined Labour, then resigned in 1930 when his unemployment proposals were rejected. In 1931, he launched the new party, backed by George Bernard Shaw and Sir William Morris. Though it failed electorally, Diana was enthralled by his vision. On October 1, 1932, he founded the British Union of Fascists, or BUF, modeled on Mussolini's regime. The BUF's early platform emphasized nationalism, modernization, and discipline, before its descent into anti-Semitism. His manifesto, The Greater Britain, stressed civic duty and centralized executive power. James Lees Milne recalled Mosley's early magnetism, but warned of his growing arrogance and reliance on violence. Initially praised, Mosley's support waned as rallies turned ugly, despite Mussolini's endorsement. Fascism still carried prestige in Britain. Mussolini was admired for restoring order, Hitler for reviving German industry. To many elites, Mosley seemed like a rational middle ground between revolution and decay. Privately, Mosley's life was unraveling. His wife, Cynthia Curzon, nicknamed Simi, was the daughter of Lord Curzon, the former Viceroy of India. Up to that time, Simi had tolerated Mosley's numerous affairs, but their marriage had cooled. Their son later said Mosley still loved Simi but no longer desired her. By 1932, he kept a separate flat for his affairs. As Diana and Mosley grew closer, Simi's health declined after a difficult cesarean. That year, Diana hosted Unity and cousin Robin Farrer's debutante party, where Unity met Mosley and instantly idolized him as the leader. While Mosley toured with Simi and Diana traveled with Brian, the lovers arranged a secret rendezvous in France. Diana, struck with diphtheria, feared their letters would be intercepted and sent Barbara Hutchinson to retrieve them. Once recovered, she joined Mosley, Tom, and Randolph Churchill in Venice, where their public affection devastated both Brian and Simi. By autumn 1932, the affair was known. At a Biddesden fete, Diana and Mosley danced exclusively. A desperate Cynthia begged Mosley in letters to end the affair. He coldly replied that Diana was just a phase. Diana, guilt-ridden, now faced Mosley's emotional withdrawal. As he launched the Greater Britain, established the BUF, and fenced competitively, she remained trapped in a crumbling marriage. Simi still stood beside him at rallies, until Mosley made his first public anti-Semitic remark, revealing his turn toward extremism. He introduced the black shirt uniform, modeled on his fencing jacket, but the symbolism backfired. Public perception turned toward brawls and thuggery, and moderates fled. Before departing for Rome to seek Mussolini's support, Mosley visited Diana at Biddesden. They agreed on a future together, but he refused to leave Simi. Diana, choosing love over reputation, decided to leave her husband. She broke the news to Brian, who pleaded for a delay until after Christmas for the sake of the children, and she agreed, but the bond with Moseley was final. She was now completely in his thrall. Nancy and Tom were appalled. Nancy warned Diana she risked social ruin and urged reconsideration. Even her father-in-law, Lord Moyne, tried to intervene. Diana ignored them all, even Tom's appeals, which deeply wounded her. Though loyal to Brian, Tom couldn't sway her. Diana believed love and political alignment with Moseley justified her decision. In early 1933, Brian left for Switzerland, hoping she'd change her mind, but she did not. Instead, she moved into a rented house in Somerset with Moseley, Simi, and Simi's sister, Alexandra Metcalf, nicknamed Baba. When Brian returned, Diana relocated with her sons and nanny to 2 Eaton Square, formally ending the marriage. That same month, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Meanwhile, Nancy's Highland Fling earned £90 and a second printing. She used the money to travel to the south of France, but returned to Swinbrook in fall 1933 to finish another novel, Christmas Pudding. Sidney, wary of the barely disguised family portrayals, urged her to publish under a pseudonym. Nancy's engagement to Hamish Erskine fell apart when his parents sent him to America after he was expelled from Oxford. Heartbroken, Nancy admitted to a failed suicide attempt. Nancy declined a gossip column at Tatler to preserve her literary integrity, but was devastated when Cynthia Gladwin revealed Hamish was gay. To shield her, Hamish staged a fake engagement to Kit Dunn. On the 14th of June 1933, she joined Pam and Unity at Eaton Square, the same day she received Hamish's announcement. That evening, he visited, and Nancy confessed she still hoped for a future. Within 3 weeks, she accepted a proposal from Peter Rodd, who later wrote that he was only half serious. They married on the 4th of December 1933 at St. John's, Smith Square, with Diana's sons as pages. The family celebrated warmly, but doubts lingered. Meanwhile, Diana and Moseley kept their affair discreet. Brian agreed to falsely confess adultery to expedite her divorce. Moseley visited Eaton Square secretly, tapping on her window with a walking stick. In May 1933, after a fierce argument over Diana, Cynthia Moseley fell ill at Save Hay Farm. Hospitalized with a ruptured appendix, she died of peritonitis on the 15th of May. Her surgeon said she had not fought to survive. Moseley was shattered. He sat by her coffin, wandered her garden, and scared her sisters so much they confiscated a revolver. When they discovered he had visited Diana the night Simi fell ill, they were horrified. Irene Ravensdale called it betrayal. Leaving the children with their grandmother, Moseley resumed his relationship with Diana, citing moral duty. Simi's family was outraged. Diana, shaken, was now cast as the woman who broke Simi's heart and maybe hastened her death. Her reputation collapsed. Once adored, Diana became infamous. Unity joined the BUF around this time, unnerving the Curzons, who suspected her of spying. Irene took the older children. The baby was sent to the Isle of Wight. Moseley fled to France with Simi's sister Baba. Tensions rose between Diana and Moseley. Irene recorded a bitter argument during which Moseley dismissed her divorce as trivial, but Diana protested that it was her whole life. Their rift deepened when he traveled with Baba, now his mistress. At 22, separated, scorned, and emotionally wrecked, Diana never spoke publicly of the betrayal, but her gaunt appearance and poor health betrayed the strain. Irene hoped Baba would replace her. Diana refused to let go. In June 1933, Diana was invited back to Swinbrook. David was cold, but she reunited quietly with Unity, who that week officially joined the BUF, Moseley himself pinning on her badge. The siblings were aware of her extremism, but their parents still saw it as adolescent posturing. With Moseley in France, Diana and Unity traveled to Bavaria, hoping to visit Tom and explore Hitler's Germany. Unity had flirted with fascism before, but the pageantry of Nazi rallies lit a fire in her. Diana later said Unity's spiritual void had been filled. In Munich, they stayed with Hitler's press chief, Ernst Putzi Hanfstengel, who blamed reports of Nazi violence on British propaganda. He arranged VIP access to the 1933 Nuremberg rally. The spectacle, banners, choreography, Hitler's theatrical entrance, overwhelmed them. Unity was transformed. Back at Swinbrook, Unity and Diana hadn't yet met Hitler. At home, Unity gushed about the regime until David exploded, calling the Nazis a murderous gang of pests and forbidding further involvement. With her sons at Biddiston and Moseley abroad, Diana spent 6 weeks in Rome with Lord Berners, the eccentric composer who offered refuge from scandal. He later staged a fake engagement with Violet Trefusis in Paris to stir gossip. He would become Lord Merlin in The Pursuit of Love. By late 1933, Unity was secretly traveling to Oxford to distribute the black shirt and attend BUF rallies in uniform. Her parents, unaware, insisted she join the London season. At home, she and Decca grilled guests. Are you a fascist or a communist? Nancy and Deborah occasionally joined BUF events, more from loyalty to Diana than conviction. Nancy admitted Moseley's speeches were compelling, despite phlegmatic crowds. That winter, Diana retreated from society. When Moseley, recovering from phlebitis, invited her to Provence, she joined him. For the first time, they lived openly as a couple. Though relations with her family improved slightly, David still refused to say Moseley's name. He wrote it down, locked it away, and referred to him only as that man, convinced he would bring disaster. That autumn, Jessica and cousin Anne Ferrer moved to Paris to study French. With Sydney away, Jessica thrived. Enrolling at the Sorbonne, reading L'Humanité, and enjoying cinemas and cabarets. Paris was transformative. Her letters grew sharper, her perspective more cosmopolitan. Though still politically fluid, her desire to escape Swinbrook and live intellectually free was cemented. In early 1934, Unity pleaded to study in Germany, officially to improve her German like Tom. In truth, she was obsessed with Nazism after the 1933 Nuremberg rally. Misled by the school's Polish, Sydney approved. Unity enrolled at Baroness Laroche's finishing school in Munich, a reputable front that gave Sydney false comfort. By then, Sydney believed the family was stabilizing. Diana's scandal had quieted, Nancy was married, Jessica thrived in Paris, Pam ran Biddiston, Deborah was content, and Unity seemed focused, but ideological fractures were quietly forming. Nancy and her husband, Peter, briefly flirted with fascism, buying black shirts and attending BUF rallies. Nancy later dismissed it as ignorant play acting. Peter soon joined the Labour Party. That same year, Nancy began Whigs on the Green, a biting satire of fascism and her family. Eugenia Malmain, a blonde, bombastic fascist, was a parody of Unity. Though it stung, her sisters recognized the wit. That spring, Jessica returned to Swinbrook and first heard of her cousin, Esmond Romilly, expelled from Wellington after founding a pacifist magazine. Jessica idolized him instantly. Though many would claim she embraced communism in response to Unity's fascism, Jessica credited Nancy's heartbreak and disillusionment with marriage as the true catalyst. Watching Nancy suffer convinced her to reject male dependence and embrace radical politics. Shortly after, Sydney traveled to Europe with Unity, Jessica, and cousin Anna. Decca and Iden returned to the Sorbonne. Unity began her fateful year in Munich. At finishing school, Unity abandoned etiquette for Nazi immersion. She studied under pro-Nazi Frau Baum, spoke only German, and loitered daily at Hitler's favorite cafes, Osteria Bavaria and the Carlton, hoping to meet him. In June 1934, painter Derek Hill spotted Hitler at the Carlton and called Unity. She rushed over, so overwhelmed Hill had to steady her teacup. Days later came the Night of the Long Knives, a brutal purge of Hitler's rivals. While most recoiled, Unity wrote Diana in breathless defense of the violence. Back at Swinbrook that summer, Unity was transformed, polished, fanatical, and emboldened. Her debates with Jessica grew fiercer. Sydney, impressed by Unity's letters, agreed to let Decca and cousin Anna return to Munich that fall. Diana moved into a Biedermeier furnished flat on Ludwigstrasse. Unity soon joined her, leaving her hostel. Through winter 1934-35, the sisters lived in Hitler's orbit. Unity loitered daily at Osteria. Diana, using Hanfstengel's press credentials, attended rallies. Unity idolized Hitler. Diana admired his political force, but remained firmly aligned with Mosley. They also explored Munich's culture, museums, parks, neoclassical architecture, enchanted by its veneer of order despite the smell of beer and brewing repression. Though later mocked as Hitler groupies, many in Britain's elite found Nazi Germany seductive at the time. In September, Sydney visited Munich with Jessica and cousin Anna. She admired the city but clashed with Unity, who mockingly goose-stepped past the Feldherrnhalle. Sydney refused to approach the site. Jessica stayed quiet, but later confessed in Haunts and Rebels that she fantasized about assassinating Hitler. Reading the Brown Book of Hitler Terror and Beverly Nichols' Cry Havoc cemented her communist beliefs and horror at fascism. By 1935, Jessica was all in. She believed Nazi atrocity reports fully and read the Daily Worker, ignoring signs of Stalinist violence. For her, fascism was the greater evil. Despite her awakening, Jessica was forced into the debutante season. Expecting Parisian freedom, she found herself paraded among what she called the chinless wonders. In quiet rebellion, she hid chocolates in her bouquet, which spilled mid-photo with Nancy. After her debut in finishing school, Jessica returned to Swinbrook in despair. No job, no fiancé, no freedom. Her only hope, £50 hidden in her running away fund. Sydney dismissed her as melodramatic, but Jessica's anguish stemmed from real deprivation of education, autonomy, identity. In early 1935, David traveled to Munich with Unity and was introduced to Hitler at Osteria, Bavaria. Though they didn't speak, David came away impressed. He told Diana chillingly that he had been in the wrong, a sign of Unity's growing influence. Unity doubled down. She befriended guards at the Brown House, frequented Hitler's haunts, and made herself visible. Eventually it worked. Hitler asked who she was. On the 9th of February 1935, Unity was invited to lunch. Shaking, she sat beside Hitler for 30 minutes, discussing Wagner, London, the Autobahn, and World War I. He paid for her meal and signed a postcard. She called it the happiest day of her life. From that moment, Unity was all his. She embraced Nazi ideology completely, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and militarism. Between 1935 and 1939, she met Hitler at least 140 times, dined regularly at Osteria or the Carlton, met Goebbels, and became a visible figure in Nazi circles. Historians debate Hitler's motives. Some point to Unity's eccentricity, others to her Churchill connection, though it's unclear if he knew. Most agree he simply liked her. Unity began introducing family members to Hitler. In April 1935, she and Mosley had lunch with the Führer. Later, Sydney took tea with him, embarrassing Unity by rambling about health food. Pam dined with him and found him unimpressive, except for the potatoes. Tom visited quietly. Unity believed he was momentarily swayed. In June 1935, Unity published a letter in Der Stürmer, declaring herself to be a Jew-hater. Even among Nazis, the paper was grotesque. Unity saw the letter as loyalty to Hitler. Her family was horrified. In Britain, her reputation was destroyed. In Germany, it cemented her celebrity. She gave interviews, delivered a Nazi rally speech in uniform, and embraced her notoriety, signing Unity Valkyrie and highlighting her birthplace, Swastika, Ontario. David and Sydney canceled a planned visit and demanded her return. Unity downplayed the uproar and remained exhilarated. Her German peers were stunned by her boldness. Back in London, Unity stayed with Diana and caused outrage again, this time for performing Nazi salutes at socialist rallies. At Swinbrook, she proposed hanging Julius Streicher's signed photo opposite Jessica's Lenin bust. Even Diana, once a defender, now disavowed Streicher. Unity returned to Munich that fall, bringing David. He failed to enlist the British consul's help in curbing her. Recovering from tonsillitis, Unity mocked his German and homesickness. Still, David sent her £125 yearly. Nancy's wigs on the green enraged Diana and Unity, who recognized themselves in her satire. Nancy pleaded for forgiveness, citing financial strain, though it didn't work. By the time of publication, Mosley's BUF had shifted from posh eccentricity to menace. After the violence at Mosley's June 7th rally at the Olympia, fascism looked less like pageantry and more like thuggery. Mosley avoided open anti-Semitism, but BUF rhetoric darkened. Still, in 1936, a Gallup poll showed 70% of Britons under 30 preferred fascism to communism. British papers began reporting Nazi atrocities, attacks on Jews, segregation signs, looted businesses. The public barely reacted while Mosley called it a Jewish quarrel and refused to condemn it, sealing the BUF's reputation. Nancy and Peter, once sympathetic, turned sharply. Peter declined a German embassy invite, in Yiddish. Nancy's book skewered Mosley with ruthless wit, triggering a lasting rift. Mosley banned her from seeing Diana for 4 years. Unity swore never to speak to her again. Nancy later cited bad taste for refusing to reprint it, but the family fallout was key. In September 1935, Unity, Diana, and Tom attended the Nuremberg rally. Pictured near Eva Braun and Nazi symbols, the images cemented their reputations as Nazi sympathizers. Though Diana and Mosley remained politically aligned, his affair with Baba Metcalfe caused her deep pain. In Italy, she caught them dining together. With the crown princess, she held her composure. That summer, Diana became pregnant by Mosley. Fearing scandal, she had an abortion, an experience she never forgot. She later said the desire for legitimate children was a key reason she married him. By early 1936, Diana and Mosley were planning a secret wedding. To avoid the bans in Paris, Diana leased Wootton Lodge in Staffordshire, funded by Mosley. She ran the household and staff. That spring, the younger sisters reunited for a chaotic family trip. In Paris, Unity and Jessica pretended to court Dolly Wilde, scandalizing Sydney. At a London lecture, Unity defended Nazism. Shockingly, Sydney wrote to the Daily Telegraph, claiming Nazism was preferable to communism. In Spain, Unity's Hitler badge sparked a riot at the Alhambra. The family fled. Unity and Jessica began fighting in the car, and Sydney confined them to their cabins. For Jessica, it was a breaking point, and she began quietly plotting her escape. Back in England, the sisters' fragile truce collapsed. Jessica was alarmed by growing British apathy, especially after Hitler occupied the Rhineland and Mussolini invaded Abyssinia. But it was the Spanish Civil War that electrified her. She saw it as the ideological battle of her time. Learning that cousin Esmond Romilly had joined the International Brigade only intensified her conviction. In summer 1936, Diana and Unity attended the Berlin Olympics as guests of the Goebbels family. They weren't interested in sport, but adored the spectacle: torchlit banquets, ballets, high society. Later, they were chauffeured in Hitler's car to Bayreuth. At lunch with Goebbels, the sisters criticized Ribbentrop's appointment as ambassador to Britain. The comment briefly jeopardized Unity's access to Hitler, but his personal affection for her endured. In private, Hitler amused them with games and Mussolini impressions. Diana, meanwhile, had a mission: save the BUF. She proposed a Nazi-backed radio station to beam fascist propaganda into Britain. To hide BUF involvement, she helped form a shell company, Airtime Limited, offering Germany hard currency and ad revenue. Unity was unaware. Despite the promise, Goebbels vetoed the plan. Hitler deferred to his ministers, and the project died quietly. Amid all this, Magda Goebbels confided in Diana about her husband's affair with actress Lida Barova. She sympathized and offered Diana the Goebbels home for her wedding. Hitler approved and offered to attend. On the 6th of October 1936, Diana secretly married Oswald Mosley in a civil ceremony at the Goebbels Berlin home. Hitler arrived through the garden. Unity watched from above. The brief ceremony ended with a gift: a silver-framed portrait signed A.H. Guests included the Goebbels, Unity, and BUF members Bill Allen and Gordon Canning. The British consul refused to attend. After a modest reception, Diana and Mosley attended a Nazi rally. That night, they quarreled at the Kaiserhof Hotel, casting a shadow over their wedding. The next day, they returned to England. Only Tom and their parents knew. David and Sydney, though relieved it was formalized, forbade Deborah from visiting Wootton Lodge. Unity told Diana that Sydney was quietly heartbroken. Nancy remained estranged, hurt by Diana's strict non-speakers policy. She masked the pain with sarcasm. That summer, tensions flared during a trip to Brittany with Peter, Rod, and Jessica, especially when Peter rekindled an affair with Mary Sewell. Nancy's marriage was crumbling. Peter was unfaithful, and the couple's infertility loomed. In autumn 1936, Pamela got engaged to Derek Jackson, a brilliant, eccentric physicist and jockey, orphaned and defrauded in youth. Deborah, 16, idolized him and fainted when she heard the news. They married on December 29th at the Carlton Register office. Unity, Jessica, and Deborah didn't attend. Days later, Derek's twin died in a sleigh crash. Pam said he was never the same. After the wedding, Jessica spiraled into depression. A trip to Scotland with Sydney and Deborah didn't help. Sydney proposed a world cruise in March 1937 to prepare Deborah for society, but Jessica refused, outraged by Britain's inaction in the Spanish Civil War. In January 1937, Jessica visited Havering House, hoping for news of her cousin Esmond Romilly. He arrived that very day, fresh from Badia del Monte. Of his 120-man unit, only 37 survived. He was recovering from dysentery, reporting for the News Chronicle, and visiting families of fallen comrades. Jessica was instantly captivated. Inspired by his courage, she contacted his brother Giles, hoping to run off to Spain. Giles and Peter Neville told Esmond of her growing admiration. He was intrigued. At dinner, Jessica, nervous and mauve lame, met Esmond. They bonded instantly over politics and defiance. She asked to join him in Spain, and he said yes. Suddenly, she was overwhelmed and in love. By morning, they had a plan. Esmond had £10 from the Chronicle. Jessica would pose as his secretary to get a visa, using her £50 running away fund. Within 24 hours, it was in motion. Back in London, Jessica forged a letter from the Paget twins inviting her to Dieppe and opened it in front of Sydney, who believed it, offering her £30 from her cruise budget. Jessica withdrew her savings and met Esmond to finalize details. On the 7th of February 1937, Sydney and David saw her off at the station. Jessica, shaking, relaxed only when she spotted Esmond on the platform. For 10 days, she mailed forged letters from France, pretending to sightsee. Sydney grew suspicious. contacted the Pagets, and realized the truth. Panic followed. The family feared she'd fled to Soviet Russia. Meanwhile, Jessica and Esmond traveled through France, euphoric. Esmond fell in love. They pledged to live as husband and wife, though too young to marry legally. Esmond asked his mother Nellie for protection. In Bayonne, they argued. Jessica was appalled by a man abusing a dog. Esmond dismissed her reaction as sentimental. It shattered her illusions about ideological purity, yet their bond deepened. On the 20th of February, Esmond wrote his mother, telling her that they were married in spirit and planned 3 children. He warned the Mitfords not to interfere. Sydney begged Jessica to return, revealing the cruise was cancelled. Aunt Nellie warned of Esmond's recklessness and the dangers of Spain. At home, reactions ranged from fury to disbelief. Jessica reached Bilbao, her revolutionary dream made real, but conditions were grim. Their lodgings were filthy, food was scarce, and electricity failed. It was her first taste of war. At the front, she visited journalists, once fired a rifle, only to be knocked backward, hitting a tree. Her romantic notions clashed with war's brutal reality. She settled into a routine, reporting to the press bureau, writing letters, and hiding her fear. Her dispatches emphasized fascist brutality, but concealed the nightly shelling and despair. The Mitfords declared Jessica a ward of the court. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden approved a rescue. Nancy and Peter were allowed to board a British destroyer to Bermeo, and Esmond was warned that marrying her could mean prison. British tabloids exploded. Pierre's daughter elopes to Spain. The Daily Express misidentified Deborah as the runaway, and she sued and won £1,000, which she used to buy a fur coat, in ironic contrast to Jessica's wartime squalor. Letters poured in. Nanny begged Jessica to pack proper underwear. Sydney's handwritten plea, delivered by Peter Neville, described David's collapse and sleepless nights. The household fractured. Diana, Unity, and Tom supported Jessica, much to Sydney's anguish. Aunt Weenie wished her dead and blamed Diana for radicalizing both girls. David, weak and shocked, issued threats no one took seriously. Unity, considered for the rescue, was deemed too unstable. Instead, she returned to Germany in a black car paid for by David and met privately with Hitler for 2 hours. Out of respect for Unity, Hitler suppressed German press coverage of the scandal, something Unity valued, though Jessica never would. Jessica and Esmond were summoned by Vice Consul Arthur Pack, who delivered a telegram officially declaring Jessica a ward of court. At the embassy in Bilbao, Sir Henry Chilton issued an ultimatum. If she didn't board the Royal Navy destroyer, civilian evacuations would stop. Under pressure, they agreed, on condition they disembark in France. In Saint-Jean-de-Luz, Nancy and Peter Rod met them. Jessica had hoped for comfort from her elder sister, but got hours of scolding instead. Nancy warned her that staying with Esmond would destroy her socially. Esmond was insulted by Peter's offer of money, and Jessica left disillusioned, seeing Nancy as yet another adult she couldn't trust. Stranded in Bayonne, broke and legally unmarried, they had just 9 shillings. Esmond's News Chronicle advance was gone, Jessica's savings spent. The consul denied Esmond a visa to rejoin the fighting. He took work with Reuters, earning £2 a week, translating broadcasts, and fabricating phalangist reports for Balance. Unity wrote with joking affection. She'd shoot Esmond for the cause, but hoped to stay friends with Jessica. Esmond rejected reconciliation. In Badia, he called fascism a form of emotional greed. Sydney visited in a final attempt to bring Jessica home. Her calm impressed Esmond. Jessica confided she might be pregnant. Alarmed, Sydney still promised support, and they parted with rare warmth. To counter headlines, Esmond gave an interview to the News Chronicle, accusing Britain of diplomatic blackmail. On the 18th of May 1937, Jessica and Esmond were married at the British consulate in Bayonne. Sidney and Nellie Romilly attended. Diana sent jewelry, Unity a gramophone. Jessica wore a plain dress meant to hide her pregnancy. The mood was subdued, wary but resolved. Sidney acknowledged their love and Esmond's character, but left worried. With no home and no money, they had only a hotel room. Before heading to Florence with Deborah, Sidney arranged a brief holiday for her youngest, one last maternal gesture. Esmond picked up freelance work translating for Basque officials and filing dispatches at £5 each. He began drafting his memoir, titled Boudia. Jessica supported him but felt guilty for keeping him from returning to Spain. In July, they enjoyed Bayonne's fiesta, but the fall of Bilbao and bombing of Guernica crushed their hopes. War no longer felt noble. A brief lift came with gifts and a book advance, but Esmond gambled away their £50 at a casino. Humiliated, Jessica appealed to Sidney, who quietly sent £13, £3 as a gift, £10 from Jessica's clothing allowance. Even the Mitford budget was strained. The sisters' allowances were being reduced. They traveled to England in a borrowed car that broke down in Dieppe. With winter coming and Jessica visibly pregnant, they accepted a flat in Rotherhithe and prepared to start again. Jessica's scandal delayed Deborah's debut ball. As consolation, she was sent to Castle Howard while Nanny Blore tended to Pamela, recovering from a failed fertility treatment. With Diana branded a fascist, Unity a Nazi, and Jessica a communist rebel, Sidney clung to Deborah's respectability. She guarded her youngest's image obsessively, determined to keep her untouched by scandal. Deborah joined Sidney in Austria at the von Almasy estate, home of Nazi sympathizers. In March 1938, they witnessed crowds cheering the Anschluss. Unity personally wrote to Winston Churchill, calling it joyous and genius. Churchill replied firmly, "Only a free vote could reflect the truth." Unity ignored or refused to see the regime's violence, arrests, and repression. Hitler praised Unity as the only Englishwoman in Austria to publicly support him, highlighting her disturbing role as a British propagandist. Soon enough, however, even Nazi officials began to see her as dangerously unhinged. Her indiscretions alarmed both German and British authorities. She was a horrible gossip, quoted Hitler verbatim, and breached protocol shamelessly. While Eva Braun remained invisible and Diana was calculating, Unity was theatrical and erratic. She began informally passing messages between British contacts and Hitler. In one case, she falsely denied that Britain was blocking a meeting between Hitler and the Duke of Windsor. Hitler, according to Leni Riefenstahl, found Unity very attractive, but said he could never love a non-German. Love, like politics, had borders. Diana, by contrast, remained poised. Her BUF-backed propaganda radio station, Airtime Limited, initially rejected by Goebbels, was revived in 1938 with Hitler's direct approval. A joint venture launched on Heligoland. Meanwhile, Jessica and Esmond were living in near poverty in Rotherhithe. She worked in market research. He wrote ads. Family contact was minimal. Esmond distrusted them. Only Tom stayed in touch, privately expressing fascist sympathies to some, but telling Jessica he supported communism. In October 1937, Unity visited Jessica, without Esmond knowing. They shopped for baby items. On the 20th of December, Jessica gave birth to Julia Decca Romilly. Sidney and Unity visited on Christmas Eve but expressed concern over the baby's appearance. Esmond rejected all family help, even from Nanny Blore. Diana's baby gifts were returned unopened. Soon after, Jessica became pregnant again. With no money and worsening conditions, she underwent an illegal abortion in the East End using a soap injection, nearly killing her. The trauma shaped her lifelong advocacy for abortion rights. Then tragedy struck. During a measles outbreak, a nurse assumed Jessica was immune and didn't recommend vaccination. Both mother and child fell ill, but only Jessica survived. She later described the grief as feeling battered into semi-consciousness in a vicious street fight. The next day, they fled to Corsica, seeking healing. Some blamed poverty for Julia's death. The Mitford household spiraled. Nancy was barred from visiting Diana or Jessica. Moseley remained persona non grata. Unity could write Jessica, but was not allowed to visit if Esmond was home. By mid-1938, Europe edged toward war. Hitler's Czechoslovakian ambitions were rationalized. His anti-Semitic speeches brushed aside. Moseley's Mind Britain's Business slogan gained traction. After Kristallnacht, Jewish persecution escalated. Jews were banned from schools, public transport, even radios, and the world barely responded. Returning to Britain in August 1938, Jessica and Esmond dove into anti-fascist activism. Esmond fought fascists in the streets with razors or knuckle dusters. Jessica raised funds for Spanish Republicans, led protests, and organized marches. While her sisters drank champagne at Nazi galas, Jessica fought tyranny with blood and grit. That summer, Diana became pregnant. She withdrew from public life. Despite restrictions, Deborah visited her, bringing along Andrew Cavendish. On the 11th of November, Diana gave birth to Alexander, forcing her and Moseley to publicly confirm their secret 1936 marriage. Nancy also became pregnant, briefly hopeful despite her failing marriage. While helping at Rutland Gate, she miscarried in September. At 34, she feared she had missed her chance at motherhood. Despite their estrangement, Sidney sent Jessica £100 for her 21st birthday. Esmond proposed they use it to emigrate. With charm and luck, they secured visas to the U.S. and quietly departed. In New York, they checked into the Shelton Hotel, maintaining appearances. Using Peter Neville's name and hotel stationery, they introduced themselves to elite circles, befriending Washington Post heiress Katharine Graham. Their lecture tour collapsed. Esmond's ad experience meant little. Jessica lied about a fashion background to land a shop job, her first real employment. Though mocked by peers, she took pride in breaking from her class. They moved into a chaotic Greenwich Village apartment shared with 2 actors. Publicly, Jessica called her sisters Nazis. Privately, she remained emotionally attached to Unity, once calling her her favorite sister. In March 1939, Unity published a Daily Mirror article advocating a British Nazi alliance and Nordic racial supremacy, sparking outrage at home. That June, she returned to England for a peace rally with Diana and Tom, who gave Moseley a fascist salute, prompting backlash, though he was excused by his commander. In July, Unity and Diana traveled to Germany for the Bayreuth Festival. Over lunch on the 2nd of August, Hitler told them war with Britain was inevitable and warned Moseley could be assassinated like Jean Jaurès, alarming Diana. That month, Unity confided to multiple siblings, including Jessica, that she would shoot herself if war broke out between her beloved nations. Ignoring evacuation warnings, she stayed in Munich, hosted guests, redecorated with Janos von Almacy, and planned to attend a Nazi rally, ignoring evacuation warnings. On August 22nd, Unity praised the Nazi-Soviet pact in a letter to Diana, believing it would avert war. But as war loomed, she expressed uncertainty, saying she might postpone suicide to see how things turn out. Her final letter, dated August 30th, begged Diana not to let her death be used to defame Hitler and mourned the likelihood of never seeing him again. By then, the Mitford family was torn apart. Lord Redesdale now called Nazis beastly Huns. Sidney still idolized Hitler and blamed Britain. Deborah witnessed endless fights over Unity, Jessica's elopement, and the looming war. Only Pamela stayed neutral. The rest were in ideological freefall. On the 3rd of September 1939, as Britain declared war, Unity left a farewell letter at the British consulate, then visited Munich's Nazi party chief Adolf Wagner. Assured she wouldn't be interned, she gave Wagner her suicide note, Nazi badge, and a photo of Hitler. That afternoon, in the Englischer Garten, she shot herself in the temple with her pearl-handled pistol. Her attempt was a failure. Luftwaffe soldiers rushed her to the hospital, though the bullet was lodged too deep to remove. Hitler sent flowers and visited her bedside on the 10th of September. They spoke briefly on the phone days later. Unity recovered slowly, but was left disfigured, partially paralyzed, and mentally impaired. In a second attempt, she swallowed her swastika badge and required emergency surgery. Hitler covered her medical costs, arranged for discreet care, and eventually moved her to Switzerland. Whether Hitler's involvement stemmed from genuine affection or fear of scandal remains uncertain. Unity now joined the tragic pattern of women close to Hitler, like Eva Braun and Geli Raubal, who attempted or committed suicide. With war cutting off communication, the Mitfords feared the worst. Her last note about escaping to the Tyrol gave them faint hope. On the 2nd of October, Teddy von Almacy finally confirmed Unity was alive, but hospitalized. That same week, a fire at the Rutland Gate storage unit destroyed much of the family's possessions. Sydney, overwhelmed, told Jessica she doubted Unity had ever believed war would happen. Nancy and Sydney grew further apart. Nancy was furious at her mother's continued Hitler worship, and especially her expressed wish that Britain lose the war. The extended Mitfords mobilized. Tom and Peter Rod enlisted, and Aunt Iris manned telephones, while Uncle Jack joined the fire brigade. Soon rationing began, and barrage balloons floated over London. Meanwhile, Deborah, quiet and dutiful, became secretly engaged to Andrew Cavendish. She told no one, likely to avoid more drama. Then, on Christmas Eve, the phone rang. It was Unity calling from Switzerland and wondering when her parents would come get her. Sydney would later call it the best Christmas gift of her life. On the 27th of December, Sydney and Deborah arrived in Switzerland. Unity was skeletal, bedridden, and confused. Her hair was unwashed, her teeth untouched since the shooting. She struggled to speak, mixed up words, and couldn't sit up. Her brain injury resembled a severe stroke. On New Year's Eve 1939, they began the return. A special ambulance took Unity to Calais. When they missed the ferry, the press descended. Sydney refused interviews, even offers of £5,000, insisting Unity was not a tabloid story. Even in the U.S., Jessica turned down a $1,000 media offer, refusing to profit from her sister's suffering. Still, leaked footage of Unity's vacant stare caused public shock. Sydney tried to restore her daughter's dignity, but the damage was impossible to hide. Back in England, Unity was hospitalized in Oxford. Nancy and Tom wept at her condition, while Unity, despite her injuries, often asked after Jessica. Nancy channeled the turmoil into Pigeon Pie, a satirical wartime novel loosely based on Jessica. Unity's return briefly reunited Sydney and David, but politics drove them apart again. David, once sympathetic to Germany, now loathed the Nazis. Sydney still adored Hitler, claiming Germans would treat the British better than the Poles. Nancy confided that her parents now hated each other. The government barred Unity from returning to Inchkenneth, the Mitford's Scottish estate, due to her Nazi ties. Only David was allowed to visit. Furious, he left Sydney and moved out for good, first to Inchkenneth, then to a small house on Rutland Gate. By early 1940, doctors confirmed Unity's brain damage was permanent. She now functioned at a child's level. Sydney clung to hope, but eventually accepted the truth. Unity fixated on Christian Science, likely a result of brain trauma, not ideology. In America, Jessica and Esmond were scraping by in Miami, where Esmond illegally ran a bar. But after Hitler invaded Western Europe in May 1940 and Churchill replaced Chamberlain, everything changed. Esmond's father died suddenly, his brother Giles went missing in action. Nellie Romilly gently urged Esmond to follow his conscience, and he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jessica and Esmond sold their bar and returned to Washington. Before he left, she secretly resolved to become pregnant, knowing he disapproved during wartime. She succeeded and expected to give birth in early 1941. They stayed close through letters and calls. Meanwhile, Diana and Moseley were unraveling. Their Nazi-funded radio project collapsed with the war's outbreak. Forced to leave Wootton, they moved to Save Hay Farm. Moseley continued calling for peace, but many saw him as a traitor. Even Diana admitted their Hitler ties had permanently ruined their reputations. On the 23rd of May 1940, Moseley was arrested under Regulation 18B as a national security threat. Diana visited him in Brixton, unaware she'd soon join him. On the 29th of June, she too was arrested. MI5 considered her even more dangerous due to her personal connection with Hitler and central role in BUF propaganda. Her arrest was hastened by denunciations from her former father-in-law, Lord Moyne, Moseley's former sister-in-law and lover, Irene Ravensdale, and most shockingly, Nancy, who reported her as an extremely dangerous person. Diana gave birth to her son Max in custody, then was sent to Holloway Prison. Nancy never regretted informing on her. When the Blitz began, she mocked the idea Diana was safer in jail, only for Holloway's B Wing to be hit by a bomb. Living near Paddington, Nancy endured the Blitz, sirens, air raids, and emotional numbness. She reopened 26 Rutland Gate to evacuees and was recruited by the War Office to charm and spy on officers at the Free French Club. There, she met Major André Roy, his flirtation a rare spark after Peter Rod's serial infidelity and a dying marriage. At Swinbrook, Unity's mental health deteriorated. She was erratic and aggressive. Sidney remained devoted, David emotionally absent. Deborah's engagement to Andrew Cavendish brought relief and a future to focus on. She spent an increasing amount of time at Chatsworth. On the 9th of February 1941, Jessica gave birth to a daughter, Constancia Romilly, nicknamed Dinky, in Washington. In April, Deborah married Andrew at the bomb-damaged St. Bartholomew the Great. The reception was held at Rutland Gate, still marked by air raids. All the siblings attended, except Jessica, who was in America, and Diana, still imprisoned. Jessica and Dinky joined Esmond briefly near his RCAF base in Ontario. That June, they vacationed on Martha's Vineyard. It would be their last time together as a family. On the 27th of June, 1941, Esmond deployed to Europe. Emotionally worn, he wrote to Jessica about the horrors of war, friends lost, bodies in the sea. In one letter, he lamented the cold anonymity of wartime death and declared that missing in action was crueler to loved ones than death itself. He vowed never to be taken alive. In late November, he wrote joyfully, envisioning their reunion and a joyful Christmas together. Jessica cabled back on the 1st of December, telling him she was terrifically excited and would be leaving with Dinky on Friday. The next day, she received the telegram. Esmond was missing in action. Refusing to believe he was dead, Jessica launched frantic inquiries. 10 days later, confirmation arrived. His plane had vanished off the Yorkshire coast. Still, she clung to hope, rereading his letters for hidden signs. Her grief ran deep, masked by outward composure. Friends like Virginia Durr, whom she was staying with at the time, saw her crying through the night. Her sorrow hardened into rage, directed not at Unity, but Diana, whom she blamed for fostering fascism. Meanwhile, tragedy rippled through the family. Deborah's first baby was stillborn. Nancy suffered an ectopic pregnancy and could no longer have children. Despite their past, she began mending ties with Diana, hosting her sons during visits from prison. In 1942, she met the man who would become her greatest love, and her greatest disappointment, Gaston Palewski, de Gaulle's brilliant but emotionally elusive chief of staff. He had a deep and lasting effect on her, and she immortalized him as Fabrice de Sauveterre in The Pursuit of Love, which launched her into literary fame. By Christmas 1940, Diana was still imprisoned under Regulation 18b, considered too notorious to release. In a 1941 hearing, she downplayed her Hitler connection and insisted she and Mosley had always sought peace. Mosley claimed his World War I service proved his patriotism, but their arrogance and refusal to disavow Hitler made release politically impossible. Reunited in spring 1941, the couple were moved to a shared detention suite. Despite press hysteria, conditions were modest. They cooked, gardened, and played Wagner. Mosley's eldest son Nicholas visited regularly and smuggled treats. Books, tinned meats, and liquor. They quickly turned prison into a strange domestic routine. In Washington, Jessica rebuilt. She took a typist job at the Office of Price Administration, earning $1,440 a year. While investigating ration fraud, she met Robert Treuhaft, a witty, Jewish leftist lawyer. They grew close, bonding over shared politics and purpose. In May 1943, she was sent to Seattle. Bob followed and proposed just 2 days later. Jessica accepted. Though some doubted the match, she was fiercely proud, calling their love redemptive. Bob loved both her and little Dinky. That summer, the Mosleys were released. Jessica was furious and warned Sidney that any hospitality shown to them would sever ties. Over 40,000 Britons protested the release, with Jessica joining the outcry. She returned to public life with fire, writing to Winston Churchill as Cousin Winston, denouncing the Mosleys, and publicly rejecting her family's fascist ties. Hounded by the press, she snapped at one reporter and grabbed him by the throat. Her refusal to speak was twisted into scandal, deepening her distrust of the media. To escape media frenzy, Jessica and Bob moved to San Francisco and joined the Communist Party. Jessica was accepted on the condition that she overcome the handicaps of birth and upbringing. She quickly rose in rank, earning praise as county financial director. Bob joined a local campaign. Back in England, the Mitfords experienced a rare lull. David regained his eyesight after cataract surgery. Deborah gave birth to Emma in 1943, then Peregrine in 1944. Pam ran the farm, Unity was well enough to travel, and Tom, still in Italy, wrote regularly. Diana and Mosley moved into the crumbling Shaven Crown Inn with their sons. Meanwhile, Jessica shocked the family by telegram. Her son, Nicholas Tito Treuhaft, had arrived, bearing a striking resemblance to Pamela. Sidney's letters to Decca shared family news. Tom's modest life in Italy, Deborah's admiration for Kathleen Kick Kennedy, and her romance with Billy Hardington. Kick married Billy in May 1944, only to lose her brother Joe Jr. 3 months later, then Billy himself to a sniper in Belgium 1 month later. Billy's death made Andrew Cavendish heir to the dukedom. Deborah, devastated, feared losing him too. During the V1 bombings, Nancy continued public lectures, though her accent drew mockery. Peter Rod reappeared unexpectedly, exhausting her. Comfort came with a brief reunion with Palewski. Tom returned to London after 2 years abroad. In a candid conversation with James Lees Milne, he admitted past lovers, romantic disinterest, and unease with fighting Germans. Still privately fascist, he requested a transfer to Burma, seeking a war he could morally accept. He was posted to the front lines in late 1944. On the 24th of March, 1945, Tom was shot leading Indian troops and died 6 days later of pneumonia. He was buried near Yangon. Nancy, Peter, Deborah, Pam, and Nanny gathered to support Sidney and David. Diana, escorted from house arrest, was embraced by her father, who, even upon learning Mosley was waiting outside, let her go without reproach. Nancy resumed writing. Her novel, The Pursuit of Love, inspired by her family, sold 200,000 copies in its first year and gave her both fame and financial independence. With a £3,000 gift from David, she moved to Paris to be near Palewski and began work on love in a cold climate. The family now affectionately called her the French lady writer. By war's end, Sidney was engulfed in grief. Esmond, Billy, 4 nephews, and Tom were gone. Diana's children had lost their mother to prison, Unity was brain damaged, and Sidney's marriage had silently ended. David now lived apart with Margaret Wright, whom Sidney loathed, while Diana visited him faithfully. Sidney stayed alone on Inchkenneth. Before his death, David signed Inchkenneth over to Tom. But after Tom's intestate death, the island passed equally to all 6 Mitford sisters, except Jessica, who refused to grant Sidney lifelong residence. Jessica refused to relinquish her share of Inchkenneth, vowing to donate it to the Communist Party as a rejection of the family's fascist ties. Journalist Claude Cockburn tried facilitating the gift, but the party deemed the island useless. Decca ultimately sold her share to her sisters for £500, a political gesture, not a financial one. In October 1947, Jessica welcomed her 3rd child, Benjamin. Around the same time, Deborah lost a baby and traveled to Africa. Touched by an invitation from Dinky, Sidney visited Jessica in San Francisco for the first time in years. Now a mother of 3, Jessica was active in civil rights work as secretary of the East Bay Civil Rights Congress, tackling racial injustice and labor discrimination. Back in England, Unity's health deteriorated. Still mentally impaired, she was diagnosed with meningitis linked to her 1939 suicide attempt and died on the 27th of May, 1948. She was buried on June 1st at Swinbrook, and her gravestone bore the line, "Say not the struggle naught availeth," from a poem admired by Churchill. Many felt Unity had emotionally died in 1939 with the outbreak of the war. She was seen as one of the war's first casualties, her brother Tom as one of its last. Still under surveillance, the Mosleys bought Crowwood House and founded Euphorion Books to publish Oswald's political tracts, advocating a united Europe and African exploitation to rival U.S. Soviet power. In 1947, Mosley launched the Union movement, but faced bans, boycotts, and public rejection. Denied passports, he and Diana bought a yacht, traveling through Europe before settling in Ireland by 1951, admitting he had no future in Britain. Pam and Derek Jackson also moved to Ireland to avoid a 98% super tax. After renting Lismore Castle and buying Tullamaine, Derek left Pam for Janetta Key. Though he married 4 more times, Pam's marriage was his longest. They remained friends, and Derek eventually relocated to France. In 1946, the 10th Duke of Devonshire signed Chatsworth over to Andrew Cavendish, intending to survive the 5-year term needed to avoid death duties. He died unexpectedly in November 1950, just 14 weeks short, triggering an 80% inheritance tax. Andrew and Deborah, who had moved into nearby Edensor House, launched a massive effort to save Chatsworth. They sold 54,000 acres, the family's London home, major artworks, rare books, and painfully, Hardwick Hall. Deborah called it the most beautiful house in the world. The public rallied. 105,000 people visited in 1949 alone. Still, it took until 1974 to fully pay the tax. Nancy's love in a cold climate eclipsed The Pursuit of Love, cementing her literary fame. But Palewski, her great love, remained elusive. Her previous relationships, Hamish, Peter Rod, Andre Roy, had all ended in disappointment. When Rod finally filed for divorce, she felt relief but knew Palewski would never marry her. Still, her success continued with The Blessing, 1951, and Don't Tell Alfred, 1960. In 1950, Jessica and Bob Treuhaft were denied passports due to their communist ties. When subpoenaed by the California Un-American Activities Committee in 1951, Jessica invoked the Fifth, brought her daughter Dinky to shield her from harassment, and escaped with CRC records intact. She and Bob briefly went into hiding. When Bob testified, he gave a fiery speech and kicked in the DA's office door. By the mid-1950s, they'd settled in Oakland. Tragedy struck in 1955 when their son Nicholas, age 10, was killed by a bus. Dinky, who found him dying, was traumatized. Just 12 weeks later, the government approved their passports. Jessica visited England for the first time in over a decade, reconnecting with Sydney, Deborah, and their children, but refused to see Diana. Once her idol, Diana was now, for Jessica, irredeemable. A visit to Inch Kenneth ended in a furious row when Sydney invited the Mosleys to lunch. Jessica stormed out, vowing never to return. Her passport was confiscated upon re-entry, but California welcomed her home with fanfare. Yet the FBI had escalated its watch. Though never charged, the Treuhafts were blacklisted. Jessica stayed in the party after Khrushchev's 1956 speech, but by 1958, disillusioned, she and Bob resigned. That same year, Jessica completed Hans and Rebels, a witty memoir of her aristocratic past and early marriage to Esmond Romilly. Though initially rejected, the book found a champion in literary agent James McGibbon and was quickly published in both the UK and US. Around this time, David Mitford died, having disinherited Jessica, still punishing her for trying to gift her share of Inch Kenneth to the Communist Party. Nancy, furious, gave Jessica her own share, joking she might turn the island into a Soviet missile base. In 1959, using a small inheritance from Esmond Romilly's mother, Jessica bought the remaining shares from her sisters, becoming majority owner of Inch Kenneth. It was an emotional victory. She returned to England with her son Benjamin to promote the memoir. Sydney, newly diagnosed with Parkinson's, disliked her portrayal. Nancy praised the book's style, but critiqued its emotional coldness. Family gossip swirled. Still, Hans and Rebels became a bestseller. Jessica embraced her role as the Red Sheep, poking fun at her sister's fascism, Diana's imprisonment, and Pam's forgotten marriage. The book's success allowed her to buy a bigger home. At 40, Jessica finally had a career and a new target. She set her sights on the American funeral industry, launching her next crusade with mordant wit and a scalpel-sharp pen. In spring 1963, Sydney's health declined. Diagnosed with late-stage Parkinson's, she was joined by Nancy, Pam, Diana, and Deborah at Inch Kenneth. Despite flashes of lucidity, her decline was clear. Nancy, usually guarded, wept. Sydney died on the 25th of May, 1963, at the age of 83. A piper accompanied her coffin to Mull, and she was buried beside David at Swinbrook. That same year, Jessica published The American Way of Death, a scathing expose on the U.S. funeral industry, born from a Saturday Evening Post article and Bob's union work. Bob helped investigate. He even enrolled in mortuary school while Jessica posed as a grieving widow. They uncovered grotesque profiteering, coffin-up charges for so-called skin irritation, and veiled threats to mutilate bodies. Jessica's satire was razor-sharp. The book sold over $100,000 its first year. RFK reportedly chose a plain coffin for JFK after reading it. The funeral industry lashed back, calling her a Soviet sympathizer, but she didn't flinch. With her new fame, Jessica expanded her muckraking. She exposed mail-order fraud, restaurant scams, and pornographic absurdities. Later works, The American Way of Birth and Kind and Usual Punishment, targeted the medical and prison systems, though not all sold as well. By the 1970s, she remained warily connected to her sisters. She occasionally saw Pam and Deborah, and adored Diana's son Desmond, but continued to avoid Diana herself. Nancy teased her. Diana still cherished a brooch Jessica gave her in 1937. In 1969, Nancy's world unraveled when Gaston Palewski announced he was marrying someone else. The betrayal cut deeply, and he soon moved just outside of Paris. Then came worse news. Nancy had liver cancer. Diana and Deborah concealed the diagnosis, though Jessica protested, insisting Nancy deserved the truth. Nancy never acknowledged she was dying. Jessica flew to Paris but was uninvited in a cold letter, likely Diana's doing. She came anyway. Nancy, frail and in pain, saw Jessica only 3 times. Diana remained her constant. A brief remission allowed Nancy to visit East Berlin and resume work on her biography of Frederick the Great, but the illness returned. "Hurry me along," she told her doctor. Nancy died on June 30th, 1973. She refused morphine to keep her mind clear. Palewski arrived in time to hold her hand. Her last smile was for him. She was buried beside Unity in a plain coffin. Jessica, still in California, learned of her death from the paper. In classic Mitford humor, Jessica recalled Nancy's longtime joke that she would someday profit by designing cheap coffins, like the one Nancy now occupied. Nancy left behind her books, her brilliance, and a quiet devastation. By the mid-1970s, Jessica was a star lecturer at Cal State San Jose, earning honors and acclaim. Yet emotionally, she remained distant. Deborah tried to heal the rift between her sisters, but Jessica never forgave Diana for her betrayals. In 1976, David Price Jones published a biography of Unity Mitford, spotlighting her Nazi ties. Though Jessica denied close involvement, her tacit support and use of family materials enraged her sisters. Diana publicly condemned the book. Pamela recognized photos from a missing family album and accused Jessica of having taken it during research for Hans and Rebels. This accusation caused a year-long rift between the sisters. When the missing scrapbook was later found in Deborah's drawing room, no apology followed. The damage was done. Jessica felt scapegoated, especially after Harold Acton's Nancy biography ignored her entirely, using Hans and Rebels only to dispute her account. Though she and Deborah reconciled over lunch and vowed not to let the Unity book ruin them, tensions lingered. Deborah, Diana, and Pam issued a public letter condemning the biography. Clementine Churchill told Jessica the backlash was more about image than truth. Jessica, long the family's radical outlier, felt frozen out of their curated legacy. Deborah remained her emotional anchor. Though Jessica critiqued the family's silences, she sometimes overlooked Deborah's quiet burdens. Abandoned in childhood chaos, left to soothe their parents and bearing witness to the wreckage wrought by Unity, Diana, and Jessica herself. Yet affection persisted. Through letters and visits, they used their childhood code, boodle-didge, and steered clear of politics. Jessica liked Diana's younger son Desmond, but harbored lifelong disdain for Jonathan, stemming from a childhood Nazi salute and his later far-right politics. A brief reconnection with Diana during Nancy's illness didn't last. Diana's memoir, A Life of Contrasts, drew outrage for portraying Hitler as genteel and downplaying his crimes. Critics accused her of moral blindness, but the book sold well. Undeterred, she wrote a fawning biography of Wallace Simpson. Jessica mocked both works and reveled in their poor reviews. By contrast, Jessica's journalistic influence soared. Her pieces ran in top US and UK publications. Though neither sister had formal education, both achieved literary success on opposing ends of the ideological spectrum. Their estrangement was final. After Mosley's death in 1980, Diana, grief-stricken, survived a brain tumor she blamed on sorrow. Despite his infidelities, she remained loyal. Jessica stayed silent, offering respect but no forgiveness. In the early 1980s, Jessica's BBC documentary, The Honorable Rebel and Her Desert Island Discs appearance reignited tensions. But the deepest rift came with Nancy Mitford, a portrait by her sisters. While the others offered warm recollections, Jessica insisted on including a 1968 letter from Nancy, refuting Mosley's claim that Tom supported fascism. The letter from Nancy also states that Tom hated Mosley, infuriating Diana, who immediately pushed back against the letter on camera. The inclusion, seen as truth-telling by Jessica, and a deliberate insult by Diana, further fractured ties. Though sidelined in official narratives, Jessica remained unrepentant. She was never forgiven for breaking the Mitford Code of Silence. Yet even in estrangement, her love for Deborah endured. They remained close until the end. Bonded by sisterhood, sustained by letters, and held together by the last flickers of boodledage. Pamela Mitford, forever the quietest sister of the six, slipped away suddenly on the 12th of April, 1994, at the age of 86. Though she had rallied impressively from surgery for a broken leg, a cruel blood clot claimed her just moments before Deborah could reach her hospital bedside. In her characteristic flair, Pam had sparkled in gold lame at her 80th birthday celebration, and Jessica later remarked she would have despised life confined to a wheelchair. Her farewell followed the understated Mitford tradition. No sermon, just the soaring notes of holy, 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 and a living memorial tree taking root in her honor. Later that year, in November 1994, Jessica Mitford tumbled and broke her ankle while visiting her daughter Dinky in New York, her second drink-fueled injury within a year. This fall became her turning point, prompting her to abandon alcohol entirely, a transformation her husband Bob Troyhoff described as reclaiming the wife he'd missed. Though she publicly declared herself free of cigarettes too, Jessica secretly indulged until Dinky caught her red-handed. Embarrassed, yet bolstered by support, she finally broke free of tobacco's grip, though her deliverance would come too late. In June 1996, Jessica received the devastating news that she had advanced lung cancer, discovered after she casually mentioned a blood-tinged cough. Still, she stubbornly refused to disrupt her life's rhythm, holidaying in Cape Cod and pressing forward with her revision of The American Way of Death, playfully rebaptized as Death Warmed Up. Her razor-sharp humor never faltered. She even penned etiquette columns questioning whether the dying might reasonably guilt-trip their friends. By July, the cancer had invaded her liver, kidneys, and brain. With healing no longer possible, she chose radiation to preserve her clarity of mind, and with Dinky's tender care, she orchestrated a dignified end at home, refusing nourishment. She declined Deborah's offer to visit, saying, "She doesn't see the point." Surrounded by cherished books, photographs, and beloved friends, including Maya Angelou, who filled the room with song, Jessica peacefully slipped away on the 22nd of July, 1996, a mere 6 weeks after she was diagnosed. Her send-off proved as delightfully rebellious as her life. A $475 cremation, ashes scattered to the sea's embrace, and a San Francisco memorial where a horse-drawn glass hearse carried not her remains, but her literary legacy. Over 500 souls gathered to honor her. A second London tribute, guided by Maya Angelou and Jon Snow, unfolded in a theater, never a church, in perfect, unbending Mitford fashion. The rift between Jessica and Diana remained unhealed. They lived out their final years on different continents, bound by blood but divided by politics and principle. Diana never repented. She defended Hitler and promoted Mosley until her death in Paris on August 11, 2003, at the age of 93. Deborah, Duchess of Devonshire, outlives them all. Often overshadowed by her more flamboyant sisters, she nevertheless carved out a legacy uniquely her own. With quiet determination and unmistakable charm, she transformed Chatsworth into one of England's most cherished country estates, becoming its public face, writing several acclaimed books about the home, and spearheading its extensive restoration. Of the 6 children she bore with her husband, Andrew Cavendish, only 3 survived to adulthood. They would go on to lead successful lives of their own and bless Deborah and Andrew with 8 grandchildren, among them the late supermodel Stella Tennant. Deborah, the last of the Mitford siblings, died on September 24, 2014, at the age of 94, leaving behind a legacy of resilience and quiet reinvention. Now, in the year 2025, over a decade after the last Mitford passed away, the family's legacy still endures. These 6 extraordinary sisters, each shaped by war, ideology, and wild ambition, continue to captivate. With a new series about the family premiering on June 18th, their story still shocks, seduces, entertains, and divides. So now I want to hear from you. Which Mitford sister fascinates you most, and why? What do you think pushed each of them towards such extreme political ideologies? What made Diana surrender everything for Mosley? Why did unity fall so deeply under Hitler's spell? And what kept Nancy hopelessly devoted to a man who never truly returned her love? And what do you think about the upcoming show about the sisters' lives? Do you think it's long overdue, or do you not care for biopics? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So drop a comment down below and let's keep the conversation going. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history's most extraordinary figures. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, keep seeking the stories that move your soul.